From European settlers in the 1600s to waves of immigrants seeking opportunities in the 19th and 20th centuries, the U.S. has continually evolved through the contributions of newcomers. Our next guest is Professor Erick Langer. He shares with us the intricate history and current landscape of U.S. immigration, providing crucial insights into the evolving impact of immigration policies. In the early 1900s, over 15 million immigrants surged into the U.S. By 1910, 3/4 of New York City's population was made up of immigrants or their children. Unlike previous waves, these newcomers came mainly from non-English-speaking countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, like Italy, Poland, and Russia. This shift created hurdles for immigrants and locals alike.
In 2024, we have something very similar happening in the sense that you've also had a wave of migration into the United States over the last 20, 30 years that also has created this kind of crisis of identity, because as we in the United States describe race and ethnicity, one thing that's quite clear is that demographically, white men in particular will become the minority and will not be able to continue to be in power in the way that they had been before. Now, of course, the whole idea of who is white has changed, because in 1924, Italians were not considered white. Irish were sometimes not considered white. And so you have a very interesting kind of parallel about 100 years later, and we're talking about that. The other thing is, of course, that in the 1920s, you didn't really have much legislation about immigration. And so this is the time when you have, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, other things where you're trying to, where the United States tries to restrict immigration, again, on racial kind of terms. And since then, the United States has had, of course, an immigration system, but the major overhaul of immigration was all the way back in 1986 under Ronald Reagan, under which about 4 million people received citizenship. Yeah, nice to meet you. Yes,
We'll just
it is a
right
pleasure.
this way.
Yes, okay, let's go.
I met with Erick Langer just outside our studios in Washington, D.C. Dr. Langer is a distinguished historian and professor of Latin American history at Georgetown University. He's written, co-authored, and edited several books, along with numerous articles on the subject.
You discussed in an essay in 2016 about the consolidation of nations across the Americas after 1850, and it stabilized political boundaries, but it also had an impact on migration. Can you kind of delve into that for us?
Certainly, because one thing is, until you have actually where you know where the political boundaries are, there isn't really migration. There's not international migration. And so this whole system of laws about who belongs where and how, when you're born in a particular territory, that marks you as being from that territory, really got set into stone at that particular point. Now, since then, of course, and today, for example, things are different in a different way. And I think it has to do with some really large processes that were not the case at that particular point, such as climate change. It seems to me that much of the Central American immigration, for example, comes from the fact that people have been under drought, haven't been able to make a go of it. So even the dangers of crossing Mexico and crossing the Sonora Desert into the United States seem a better chance, especially for the children, than just starving to death in a place on their farm in Guatemala And so I think that, so there are new things as well that are very important to take into account.
Well, you mentioned it, 86, Ronald Reagan's president, we have immigration reform. He obviously was quite familiar with it. I grew up in California. He was the governor of California. I mean, in my childhood, people were spilling over the border, Tijuana, into the United States. But I think over time, we've seen kind of a difference in who's coming. How has that changed in that march that we've seen over time? Who's making the effort? And it's not just the United States that's dealing with this. Mexico's dealing with it as well, right?
Correct. That's a really big question, and there are many components to that. First of all, the vast majority of people who are undocumented here are still Mexicans. So 4 million of the 11 million are, in fact, people who have Mexican citizenship. So that actually hasn't changed that much. But of course, migration from Mexico into the United States is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. It really only begins with the Mexican Revolution, which is in the early 20th century. And so that's really a 20th century phenomenon. And that still continues today. But certainly there are other nationalities as well that are becoming important. And one thing that we're seeing is, the way we think about immigration in the United States is that people from Europe originally came over. But of course, now things are much more international than they are before. So 33%, for example, of even those who come over who are undocumented are actually from Asia. And that's something we don't really take into account. And of course, 20% of Venezuela has ended up not just in the United States, but in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile, in many other places as well. So there are lots of things going on right now, but certainly the migration from North America, because Mexico is part of North America, actually still remains the greatest component of immigration in the United States. One more small point, and that is that, in fact, we have to keep in mind that about a third of the United States used to be Mexico. So in fact, many of the people who live in, say, Arizona, in California, in New Mexico, and other places with Spanish last names, etc., might actually be there much longer than any people with English or German or whatever last names now live there.
So I have to ask about your interest in history and, of course, your interest in the region itself writ large. Talk to us about what sparked that.
Well, first of all, my parents were German and they were refugees, and my mother actually died when I was 8 years old. And so I got sent to Germany with my brothers. And then my father went there again and he remarried another German woman. And then we came back to the United States. But then I always wanted to travel around, and so I then applied for an exchange program and wanted to get back to Europe, but was sent to Bolivia, of all places. And I loved it there. And afterwards, then as a result, I went to university. I first wanted to study Eastern Europe, which was the part of Germany that became Poland, and so my ancestral. But I just got enthused by a Latin American history professor at the University of Washington, and as a result, switched to Latin American history. And then he suggested I should go on for the PhD. And so in the end, that's what I studied.
The rest is history, as well.
Right, exactly.
I talk to a lot of experts on climate change who say the best stewards are indigenous people who have this love of their land, but a lot of times there's encroachment, there's impacts on them. What have you seen in terms of indigenous people and migration?
Most of that migration, if it occurs, is usually rural to urban. And that is because of deforestation, for example, and other such issues, and thus climate change, and that creates huge problems in terms of just not being able to harvest your crop, not there might be not enough water, or it might be too cold, might be too hot. There are all kinds of things there. So indigenous peoples do matter a lot, but at this point, it's mostly rural to urban. Now, one thing that I find really interesting here is in the United States, and especially in this area, many of the workers in the kitchen are actually Maya. And they're speaking Maya, for example, in the kitchen and other places, though we think of them just, oh, well, they're just Latin Americans or Central Americans and things like that. So you have actually a relatively large population here of indigenous peoples that we in the United States don't actually recognize as indigenous because they come from other countries, such as Guatemala in particular, but also Honduras and Mexico and other places such as that.
Since 1980, immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras has fueled the growth of the Central American-born population in the United States. By 2021, 86% of Central Americans in the U.S. came from these three countries. Globally, the U.S. is the top destination for Central American migrants, according to 2020 UN estimates. You mentioned deforestation, which can drive people, and the migration may occur within the country, but we've also seen in Central America civil wars, unrest. How does that trigger things? I mean, what do you see there?
Well, certainly the civil wars began the Great Migration. And not only that, but also the creation of criminal gangs, such as, for example, MS-13. The reason why you have MS-13 really is because, for example, during the Salvadorian Civil War, there were many refugees and they went to Los Angeles. Well, the problem is there were the Mexican gangs already, and so the Salvadorians thought, well, we have to create our own gang to protect ourselves, and so they did, and then they got deported back to El Salvador, where they actually began recruiting, and the government, obviously being in civil war, wasn't capable, and to a certain extent, even the Bukele government, we can talk about that, has been able to kind of get at the problem, but it metastasized as a result, and so many people then went back to the United States. And so, in fact, to a certain extent, for example, this criminality in some criminal groups actually come because of the migration in the first place. And of course, that becomes a problem not just in their countries of origin, but also here in the United States.
You mentioned the administration in El Salvador. It's gotten a lot of press. How has it changed the narrative, or has it?
The Salvadorians that I know are uniformly in favor of the Bukele government. And also within the country, Bukele has a very, very high popularity right now. Now, the problem is, though, that I see a number of things that are problematic with that. And maybe this is because I'm an academic, not a policymaker, but in the longer term, how do you keep a significant proportion of your population incarcerated? That is incredibly expensive. Secondly, most of those people are young men. Those are presumably some of potentially the most productive members of society who then are not contributing but actually are costing society at that particular point. And thirdly, it is quite clear, and the little hints have come out, is that the Bukele government isn't quite as hard on these gangs as we might think, because it is clear that even the Bukele government has entered into negotiations with certain of the gangs and gang leaders as a means of trying to make sure that they don't make too many waves. But I think in general, the security situation in El Salvador has improved a lot, but at the cost of many different lives. And in the end, it seems to me that what the Salvadorian government must do is re-educate those folks, get them out of gangs, because just building larger and larger prisons in the end cannot be a solution for a healthy society that also wants to be productive.
Opposition to immigration is a global issue with a long history in the U.S. For over 2 centuries, various groups, such as the Irish, Chinese, and Mexicans, have faced resistance. To fully grasp this opposition, it's important to consider the broader context of immigration patterns and responses.
Some people in this country think there's just an army of these people just racing across the border. Can you talk about misconceptions and perceptions and how reality against perceptions, sometimes they don't meet?
Let me give you a specific example. My wife is Venezuelan, and so we've basically, the whole block where her parents lived on, I think in total there's maybe 2 or 3 houses that are still occupied. The rest of the 20 houses, there's nobody there anymore because they've all left. They tend to be the younger folks. It's the older folks who remain still there. And here, what you do is you contract somebody. And I think in one case, it costs them $5,000 per person. They then take a flight to Cucuta, Colombia, from whence then, in this case, they were able to fly all the way to Mexico. And this particular service provided service taking them to the wall. And there was a border agent who had a key who opened up a door and let them through. And at that point, they gave themselves up. So having caravans is actually only for the very poor who don't have any other possibility. They tend to be from Central America because you can actually walk through Mexico. But the other thing to keep in mind is that one of the reasons why numbers are actually down is because of what Mexico is doing. Mexico is making it very hard for migrants to cross the country right now. And so whatever happens in, Mexico is kind of like the cork of the bottle, that either you take out the cork and you let them in or not. So Mexico actually has quite a lot of power. But one of the things that the U.S. government has been doing over the past few years, not just the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration, is putting huge pressure on Mexico to not permit people to even get close to the border. So they get sent elsewhere, and this is something that nobody sees in this country because it's Mexican news, it's not US news. So in fact, the role of Mexico and the ability of caravans to move or not actually depends a lot on the Mexican government and how much pressure the United States puts on the Mexican government. And that pressure right now is severe. And under Claudia Sheinbaum, I suspect she will be much closer actually in line with US government policy than Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who has tried to forge an much more independent path.
I don't have the money to get on a flight, and I'm in Venezuela or Colombia or Honduras or Guatemala or you name the country, and I decide I want to go. I've seen the social media.
Right.
I know it's paved in gold. So I start that long march. Where am I likely to end now? Because as you said, we always think of migration starting one place and ending in the United States, but in many cases, that may not be open to these folks. What ends up happening then?
Central America and Mexico is a little bit different because here the goal is almost exclusively the United States, though many Central Americans now end up and remain in Mexico and actually start working there, and so aren't able to cross the border. But say a place like Venezuela, only 500,000 Venezuelans are in the United States of the approximately 5 million people altogether. So others are in places such as Chile, in Peru, in Ecuador, and mostly in neighboring Colombia, and a few in Brazil, and then some are also in Spain. And so if we're talking about migration, I think one of the really interesting things would be to look at it holistically. In other words, where are people going, just as you suggest, and then think about what that means in terms of what is the capacity of each country to take those immigrants. Obviously, also there's a whole political calculus if that's possible and if it's in fact beneficial. But in the end, it seems to me one thing that is so incredibly important when we talk about the immigration debate is the United States actually needs immigration. It is desperate for immigration because you and I are not the youngest people anymore. I want my Social Security. The only way I'm going to get my Social Security is if there are younger workers out there who continue to pay into the system, because that's actually the money I'm getting. The money that I have put into the system has already been given to those who have retired before me. So given that we actually have reproduction rates in the United States that are lower than maintaining the population, immigration is absolutely necessary for us to maintain, for example, Social Security. Plus, those people who come in, undocumented workers, often get makeup cards or get cards in the black market. They pay into the system, but they never get anything out, because those years that they're doing this illegally, because they have to pay because they have a job at, say, McDonald's or someplace like that, goes into the system, but it never gets to them because that's actually not their card. So in fact, even the illegal immigration part actually benefits us even more in terms of just monetary numbers and in terms of our retirement system.
As you point out, it's so layered and complex, and the simplistic solutions are the ones people lock on to. Thank you so much. Great insights. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.